Hello, Luke. Thanks for having me. So, in the context of Nepal, what's interesting about non-Hindu minority ethnic groups is that they've, instead of deploying indigeneity per se as a tactic for advancing political rights, they tend to operate within the framework of indigenous nationalities or ethnic minority nationalities rights in Nepal. So, the Nepal Federation of Ethnic Minority or Indigenous Nationality Rights is focused on recognizing, naming, and cataloging ethnic minority non-Hindu groups in Nepal. And this article is about how one specific group, the Kaling Rai people of the Lower Solukhumbu, aim to advance their political rights through both claims to indigeneity as first peoples of Nepal, or non-Hindu minority groups who lived in the Middle Hills prior to the unification of the Nepali state, and through their position in the Everest Mountain labor hierarchy. What's interesting about this is that Kaling Rai laborers provide the majority of the mostly manpower that undergirds the Everest industry. They're the porters, they are the lower wage guides, they are, administrative workers, and they sort of single-handedly uphold a lot of what generates massive capitalist accumulation and surplus returns in this very lucrative mountaineering and trekking industry. Now, there are also other groups. In addition to Rais, there are Limbus, there are Magars, there are many more than just the Sherpa ethnic minority group that people most often associate with mountain labor. So their attempts to gain recognition as an indigenous nationality are based on their claims to territory in the Upper Khumbu, which is an area that's been settled and dominated mostly by Sherpa groups since the formation of the Nepali state and prior. And they're interested in asserting claims to territory because they feel entitled to profit sharing from the Nepal trekking and mountaineering industry. And what this shows is that it's not just claims to indigeneity that matter, i.e. indigeneity being claims of original inhabitation of a specific place, ties to a specific place in the form of the meaningful associations between a people and their land, which is how we see articulations of indigeneity in Latin America and elsewhere. But in Nepal, we also see like a strong peasant movement that is not separate from indigeneity. But how does this research inform what I'm doing here in Myanmar? And the answer is it does so in a couple of interrelated ways. The first being I'm first and foremost interested in labor and geographies of labor. So in the Nepal context, space matters for, if anything, the separation between Kaling Rai people who were pushed down into the Lower Sulukhumbu, as they tell it in their oral histories, from Sherpas in the 18th and 19th centuries, and forfeited their land claims to this valuable, what later became a very valuable asset, which was the Everest region. In the context of Myanmar, here, my research is interested in the nuanced ways that labor can distinguish certain interstitial spaces where contributions to space, society, development take place. So I'm not interested in, say, organized movements for Rohingya rights. I'm interested in how Rohingya people are contributing to spatial transformation. So it is a bit of a shift away from my earlier work, but labor is still a central theme connecting the two.
People, is that something you're going to look at?
Likely not. I think that that's something that interests me, and it will certainly come up as I do research on people's waged and unwaged labor practices, and also gender divisions of labor in Rohingya communities. But I'm more interested in unwaged women's labor within and outside the home, and how that contributes to not only livelihoods in displacement, as many Rohingya communities are facing a new wave of displacement as we speak, but also in the ways that that labor links them to refugees, Rohingya refugees who've been resettled elsewhere, specifically in Colorado in the U.S.
So you have
It was. Interestingly, I had different and loftier goals for a dissertation that would take place exclusively in Myanmar. But when I got involved as just a volunteer, spending time with Burmese-speaking and non-Burmese-speaking ethnic minority refugees, of whom there are over 5,000 in the Denver area, it became apparent to me that doing research in my own community was important. As a feminist geographer who believes in the principles of feminist research methodology and the value of the everyday in producing scholarly knowledge, I found it to be more important that I do a research project that engages with my community, which is East Denver, Aurora. That is the community that I've worked with for several years, teaching English, volunteering in a food share with Burmese and ethnic minority speaking refugees. And so things changed. And I created and have attempted to create, I suppose, a collaborative, community-based dissertation that ostensibly serves the needs of that community in a variety of ways, and serves the needs of a community partner here in Myanmar. So it's a multi-sided and translocal dissertation.
And are these two in serious ways?
They're connected in serious ways, but part of my dissertation is probing and figuring out and mapping those connections that aren't readily visible. And partly the reason that they're not readily visible is they're connected through, the spaces of the home, the spaces of the family, the spaces of unwaged labor and resource sharing that aren't as easily tracked by conventional academic or even business or economic oriented, for example, tracking remittances or tracking conventional ways of maintaining transnational connections between refugees or displaced people. So that they do feel quite distinct, but at the same time, I do know and will continue to explore the ways in which they are intimately linked.
All of these concepts and the approach that you have sounds really interesting. Do you have any sort of hypotheses you want to share? Interesting?
Yes, so there are 3 central hypotheses to my dissertation. The first is that women Rohingya refugees' unwaged labor subsidizes the cost of urban revitalization in Aurora, Colorado. The second is that Rohingya women refugees in Aurora are connected to Rohingya women in Myanmar, specifically in Rakhine State. And I'm also looking at these connections in Yangon for a number of reasons. But these translocal connections exist, and that these translocal connections subsidize refugees' livelihoods in the United States. There's been extensive research on the ways that migrant laborers and refugees resettled in so-called the global north, they will send money and resources home to family and friends living in poorer countries. There's much less research on how people in home countries actually subsidize the livelihoods of those struggling to build lives in resettlement in the so-called global north. There have been a few key studies, one being Farnak Miraftab's 2016 book, Global Heartland. So that's the second hypothesis. The third hypothesis is that unwaged women's labor, specifically my case study is of Rohingya refugees in Aurora, that their unwaged labor facilitates processes of gentrification in Aurora through Rohingya women's beautification work in their neighborhoods. So that looks something like women landscaping, cleaning, renovating their homes, decorating, and also care work like supervising children and teens, which creates a safe, perceptibly safe and culturally diverse and ergo desirable neighborhood for would-be gentrifiers to move into. So when I say gentrifiers, I mean upper middle class and upper class, generally white families in the Denver area who have been priced out of real estate in the Denver metro area, which has been very thoroughly gentrified already, as real estate values have risen steeply since 2009. They are now looking to move into a formerly blighted region of East Denver that is becoming increasingly attractive to hip, young, and relatively affluent people. It's important to note that gentrification is generally a racialized process, that there's a lot of literature on how people of color and lower class people are displaced from their homes by generally white middle and upper class people. But there's also gentrification by minorities. There's a lot written on Black and middle class gentrification. So it's important to note those nuances, but I'm looking at how neighborhoods are changing. Neighborhoods are being improved by refugees, unwaged labor, and then how the city itself is capitalizing upon those improvements. Their tax base is increasing, the value of real estate is increasing, and refugees themselves are likely not the ones who are benefiting from these improvements in infrastructure and services.
Okay, well, it sounds like Aurora is almost your case title. It's definitely a very important time. I don't think people listening, I felt firstly about the conversation in the video, but would you add some color to is it your home city?
Aurora is not my home city. I'm from a rural area of South Denver, but growing up, interestingly, Aurora was someplace you didn't go, someplace where suburban white middle class kids gossiped about as places where there was prostitution and drugs and all of the dark corners of urban space that you were not allowed to go to. So it's interesting to me to see yoga studios and oxygen bars popping up someplace that was so dramatically emphasized as undesirable, criminal, and pathological in my youth. So Colfax Avenue is the longest, correct me if I'm wrong, the longest avenue in the United States. And it spans over 26 miles east to west from East Denver, where there was an Air Force base that was built in the 1950s and that drew large numbers of white working class people to the area in the 50s and 60s. When the Air Force Base closed in the 1970s, there was extreme white flight from the area through the 80s and 90s, and the city transitioned from an industrial working class, mostly white, suburban city of Denver to a sort of minority and lower working class urban landscape. And that was the affordable place where folks could live. Many work at the airport, the Denver International Airport, which is relatively nearby. And there's a colorful array of immigrant businesses such as hair salons, panaderias. There's a large Latino population there. And there's over 30,000 Ethiopian refugees. It's a multicultural place, and it's become a site of refugee resettlement as Denver became more and more expensive in the 2000s, and as urban revitalization and gentrification took hold there. Aurora became an affordable place for refugees to make lives. And in the 90s, when refugees were resettled in mass, and then in the 2000s from different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as a large population of South and Southeast Asians, Aurora became the epicenter for refugee resettlement because it was more affordable. And in 2009, a major refugee resettlement service center relocated from Denver to Aurora. So that really marked an important transition in communicating, well, this space, this city is, I'm generalizing here, but it's for the poor, it's for the immigrants. This is where we're going to put refugees. But interestingly, as I started working with Burmese-speaking ethnic minority refugees in Aurora, I noticed that the neighborhood was changing rapidly, and that the city had undertaken a campaign to renovate and rehabilitate, changing its image from a blighted, criminal, and ghettoized city to one of vibrant global multiculturalism, a place where refugee businesses thrived and made a desirable, safe, and economically productive place. This is where my work with Jessica Graybill, who's at Colgate University, this is where our work on what we call refugee revitalization comes in. It's a term that I came up with to think about the role of refugees in transforming urban space. And the key point of thinking about this is questioning the seemingly unquestionable narrative that refugees are economic assets, that refugees can contribute positively to ailing urban centers like Detroit, Utica, New York, other places in the United States that have seen outmigration, economic decline, and infrastructural disintegration. There's an interesting article in New York Times called "Why Not Let Syrian Refugees Settle Detroit?" Sounds great, right? We bring in people who are dispossessed, in need of homes, and they, in turn, revitalize and make vibrant, livable urban space out of a decrepit and degenerated shell of a city. Well, the problem with that is that it reduces human life to labor productivity, labor value. And that's something that when we look more closely at these narratives of refugee revitalization that we saw emerge specifically at a very specific moment in time after President Trump's so-called Muslim refugee ban. In an effort to counter narratives about Muslims' allegedly pathological and tendencies towards terrorism, advocates for Muslim refugees argued that they opened valuable businesses, contributed to their host economies, they were doctors, they were lawyers, they are valuable additions to the American milieu, or even global milieu. In Greece, similar arguments have been made about Syrian refugees, that they're economic assets. Well, the problem with that is it puts a double burden on refugees. And what Jessica and I are exploring is how this double burden constitutes life for refugees who not only are they moving to a new place and rebuilding their lives, they're also saddled with the responsibility of transforming urban space and making once abandoned or even dangerous infrastructure, such as old Victorian homes with lead piping in the context of where Jessica works in Utica, New York, or in my research site in Aurora, blighted, often polluted lots and abandoned or decaying neighborhoods, transforming those into valuable real estate. That is largely performed through refugees' own labor, which is then, in turn, often performed by refugee women's unwaged labor. And this links back to my hypothesis about women's beautification work, that decorating, transforming, ugly houses into something with curb appeal, that is valuable unwaged labor that the city can then capitalize upon as outside investment flows into the city, not only from Denver, from other United States cities, and also from international investors, developers turning once blighted lots into valuable luxury condominiums, for example. That groundwork, that labor that initially transforms these neighborhoods into someplace that developers would be interested in, or that white upper class families and middle class families from other backgrounds would want to move to. I'm hypothesizing that labor is crucially performed not only by refugee women in the city of Aurora, but also is subsidized through those women's relatives and their labor in their country's origin. So this is why translocality is an important concept for me to work with, because it allows the researcher to think about space as relationally constituted, as labor that is relationally performed, and the way in which space and labor are linked through refugees, and specifically Rohingya refugee women.
Right. So that's really fascinating. I'm thinking, why using this community to explore these questions?
Right. The answer is twofold to that. First, what we're seeing right now with the Rohingya crisis, there are no words for what's happening as we speak in Rakhine and Bangladesh. But one of the ways that I aim to subvert through my scholarship, by following a long line of militant feminists, is by creating knowledge and co-creating knowledge alongside research participants and community organizations, collaborative partners, that instead of representing Rohingyas in the way that international media accounts overwhelmingly have, as a vulnerable mass of people, as victims, as all of the things that they are and all the ways that they suffer, instead changing the discourse to show the ways that Rohingya people, Rohingya refugees, and specifically Rohingya women, contribute in substantive and meaningful ways to their environments and contribute to the production of urban space that is livable and beautiful and meaningful. And I think that in times of crisis, and where we see dispossession at mass scales, and when we also see accumulation by dispossession and all of the rather seedy things going on with the special economic zone in northern Rakhine State, I think I want to follow a legacy and perpetuate a legacy of scholarship that also challenges totalizing narratives about vulnerable people. In the same way, or in a similar way, that anti-racist scholars look to studies of privilege to disrupt dominant narratives about racism and vulnerability among people of color, I'm looking to study and explore how Rohingya people live, that they do live, that they're not just being killed, they are being killed and they are suffering, but they also live. And this is something that's very much lacking, in my opinion. Amid crisis, of course, we need, in many ways, to bear witness to that crisis, but we also need to bear witness to people's humanity and the ways in which they survive and live and contribute and continue to be human. The second answer is that I happen to be involved with Rohingyas in Aurora, and I also happen to care very deeply about their struggles in the context of Myanmar and the ways in which intersectional forms of oppression shape their engagement with urban space in interesting and I think useful ways for thinking about dispossession in urban contexts. I think Rohingyas and Rohingya refugees offer a very productive case study for thinking about a population that is generally dismissed as incredibly vulnerable and needy, and turning that discourse on its head and saying, how are the ways in which this group is producing value that is readily being appropriated and expropriated by agents of urban revitalization and change? And how is that process not only happening with refugees in Aurora, but how is it intimately linked to people in the so-called global South? And as an avid admirer and superfan of Rosa Luxemburg, I would say that capitalism is imperialism. And I believe that this case study has a lot to offer in thinking about the sneaky and nuanced ways that the so-called global North extracts value from the so-called global South in very insidious ways. It's an insidious process, and one might not readily think that a vulnerable refugee population, or in the case of Myanmar, displaced people, in the case of Bangladesh, refugee people, are contributing to the accumulation of capitalist value in the United States. But my hypothesis, and I stand by it, is that that is something that happens. And this case study aims to shed light on not only specific and historically and geographically specific processes of capitalist accumulation, but broader processes of capitalist accumulation at a global scale, and American development and gentrification as a form of global capitalist imperialism. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And the cornerstone of my research methodology is collaborative, community-based research methods, in addition to feminist research methodology and methods. So community-based research, in my case, I have two community partners, one in Aurora and one in Yangon and Sittwe. The first is Project Worthmore, which is a refugee service nonprofit that works with majority Burmese-speaking ethnic minority refugees from Myanmar. And the second is Women's Peace Network, Arakan, and that's Weiwei News organization, and I'm doing research and volunteer work for her. And the principles of community-based research hold that research should be co-created and knowledge should be co-created between not only the researcher, but also community partners and research participants themselves. And I see a lot of overlap between feminist research methods and community-based research methods. I find them to be really complementary, because where feminist research methods focus on the everyday, the importance of the mundane or banal as an important site of knowledge production, community-based research also extends feminist research goals of mitigating uneven power relations, of looking to the knowledge of research participants themselves and prioritizing that knowledge as a valuable place for creating scientific truth, so to say.
The last question for all this is, can you please give a recommendation for our listeners? Something to do with Myanmar. It can be a local restaurant, a place to go and relax. Anything you like.
My recommendation would have to be the salads at Panseria.
Panseria being a restaurant on Bogolese in downtown Yangon.
They also have fantastic mint tea. and a quiet, pensive environment for engaging in all of the deep thinking one could ever desire.
That's a great recommendation. I'm also a big fan of Pensuria and their salads. So that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much, Shay, for being on Memo Musings. It was really, really interesting.
Thank you, Liz.